Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 4th of October, where we are putting closure onto short stories and we are moving forward talking about first writing papers and then secondly our drama unit. So, as you know, we have two short stories left in our short story unit, Girl and Popular Mechanics, that I wanted to discuss. And then what we could do is talk a little bit about writing papers as well as preparing for our first major drama, which will be Oedipus the King. But before we get to Oedipus the King, we'll have some introductory readings, much like we had in the previous classes prior to our fiction section. So Girl, if you'll note in the notes below, there is a video of the author herself reading the story. It's a very short story. It's approximately a page and a half long or so. It very much sounds like a piece of poetry. So this would be a good time for you to switch the video and watch her perform. And you can come back at about 1 minute and 15 seconds. Well, hello, welcome back. So, I hope that you enjoyed listening to Jamaica Kincaid read Girl. Jamaica Kincaid being from Antigua. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about global literature. We've been mostly focusing on American and British literature. And what we've got is a mother figure who's speaking to a female child. And in many ways, it's similar to some of the short stories that we read earlier on in the semester. For instance, The Story of an Hour and also A Sorrowful Woman, about the way that female is repressed. There is a very famous interview that Jamaica Kincaid gives where she talks about her surprise that audiences from different regions find this piece to be so applicable to their own life experience, because she was really specifically talking about herself. But of course, any piece of literature talks about timeless and universal concerns. And what we've got is a list of the rules and the expectations for female in 1970s Antigua. And certainly, while some of the rules are specific to that Caribbean locale, others are much more generalized. So we can think about all cultures and the United States culture as a whole in terms of the expectations for female. And if you'll notice, one of the things about this piece that's so interesting is the use of the semicolon. And this basically is one long sentence that's connected by the use of the semicolon. And it's not that the author doesn't know how to use the semicolon, it's that the author is trying to make a thematic statement with the usage of the semicolon. A semicolon is used between two complete sentences, also known as two independent clauses. And those two sentences or independent clauses need to be very closely related to one another. So the semicolon is basically showing that close relationship between the two. And of course, all sentences that appear next to one another have a relationship to one another, but some have a closer relationship than others. And oftentimes, the use of the semicolon is a judgment call, that you can decide to use a period instead, the way we normally would do at the ending of a sentence, and then begin a new sentence. But by using the semicolon, again, you're drawing the reader's attention to the close connection between the two. And you're supposed to use this sparingly so that it doesn't lose its effectiveness. What you're supposed to generally use is the period, which is what we usually use with our writing. Now, in this particular instance, what the semicolon does is that it shows the overwhelming nature of the rules and the expectation for a female. This mother figure who's speaking to a girl figure. And there isn't even time to stop for a period. It's just one expectation after another expectation after another expectation. The girl tries to speak twice, and that is in italics. The first is she indicates, but I don't sing Benna on Sundays, and never at all in Sunday school, as her mother accuses her of singing Benna or calypso music, which would be inappropriate during services. The mother never responds, which says a great deal about the mother-daughter relationship, that there really isn't any kind of interaction. The mother is basically just giving a kind of monologue of what the girl should do. And then the very ending, when the girl asks, but what if the baker won't let me feel the bread? And the mother does respond to this and says, you mean to say that after all, You're going to be the kind of woman who the baker won't let near the bread. So this piece is interesting because in some ways it's contradictory. We are told again about what a girl should do in order to be a respectable woman in society. Washing the clothes, cooking the fritters, making sure that she's walking like a lady and not like the slut you are so bent on becoming. And notice that that is repeated several times throughout the piece, the slut you're so bent on becoming. And I know that probably our first reaction is that this will be a self-fulfilling prophecy if the girl is always accused. I think it's really more interesting in terms of the societal expectations of the time, that in order for a woman to gain respect in her society, she needs to be seen as virginal and pure. Certainly in 1978 in Antigua. Even in today's world, we have two words to talk about sexual activity for male and female. One is stud and the other is slut. And stud is associated with male, and it's usually associated with something positive. Slut is associated with female, and that's usually associated with something negative. And that's in 2022. So this emphasis over and over again, and not just housekeeping and caretaking, but also making sure that she appears to be virginal and innocent. These are all of the ways that the mother is trying to teach the girl to gain respect in society. And we see this over and over again. This is how you sweep the yard. This is how you sew on a button. This is how you set the table. Though there are also some very important pieces of social advice. This is how you smile at someone that you like, and this is how you smile at somebody that you don't really like. So, the idea of how to manage oneself in social relationships. Yet throughout this, we're told this is how to make a good medicine to throw away a child before it even becomes a child. Now, this goes in direct contrast to not becoming the slut you're so bent on becoming. So why is it that the mother would give advice to the girl about how to basically abort a child? And we see embedded throughout this piece sections of advice about what to do when you do break the rules. For instance, this is how to spit in the air, which is not very ladylike. This is how to move out of the way. So this idea of this is how to make a good medicine to throw away a child before it even becomes a child shows that the mother is suggesting ways to get around this oppressive and repressive system that they both find themselves in. So at the very ending, when the mother says that always squeeze the bread to make sure it's fresh. And the girl responds, but what if the baker won't let me feel the bread? The mother's response, you mean to say that after all, you're really going to be the kind of woman who the baker won't let near the bread? The idea is that this is a privilege that's granted, the baker allowing somebody near the bread. So how do you gain privilege and access in society when you're a girl? You follow the rules, or you seemingly follow the rules. You can still spit and get rid of a child before it becomes a child. But that would give you opportunity and access. And if you think about some of the symbols associated with bread, bread oftentimes is used as a slang term for money. So we can think about it from that perspective as well. So I think the story is more complex than just a mother dictating terms to her girl. A very interesting story would be Boy, where a mother or a father would be dictating terms to a son figure and the expectations of society, though that isn't the text that Kincaid wanted us to read. And I oftentimes think about deleting this particular story because it's very similar to some of the pieces we read earlier in the semester, specifically A Story of an Hour and a Sorrowful Woman. But I think that use of the semicolon is so interesting, especially as we're getting closer to writing a paper. And we'll talk about things like punctuation and conventions, that I really wanted to draw your attention to it. And then the last piece that I wanted us to talk about, though there's certainly many more short stories that we could do, is entitled Popular Mechanics, a very unusual title. That's something that I would have you contemplate about why it is the author chooses that particular title. And you can see that I've found links for both Girl and for Popular Mechanics online if it turns out that you don't have a hard copy of the text, though there is a hard copy on reserve in the GCC library. And Raymond Carver, the author of Popular Mechanics, is known for writing in a style called minimalist writing. And I think we've sort of seen examples of writing that's getting towards minimalist. I think about somebody like Hemingway, but this is a whole complete different level of minimalist. Think about the idea of popular mechanics. Popular means common, and I would suggest that what happens in this story is indeed common or commonplace. And mechanics is basically the explanation of how things work, and the story talks about how things don't work. One of the definitions of mechanics is two forces working against one another. I think that works very nicely for this story as well. You may perhaps be familiar with the magazine that's entitled Popular Mechanics. And this particular magazine is devoted to showing how to build things and fix things. And I would say that this particular story is devoted to showing how to take things apart and how to break things. And you may have noticed that this story also does something experimental in terms of punctuation. In this instance, it's about quotation marks. There are no quotation marks around the dialogue. And we know that you're supposed to put quotation marks around dialogue in order to give credit to the person who is speaking. I would suggest that Carver's not using quotation marks helps to universalize the dialogue, that this is less about giving a direct attribution, that this is pretty much what is said every time a couple breaks up. I'm glad you're leaving. I'm glad you're leaving. Son of a bitch, I'm glad you're leaving. So, and that's a paraphrase from the text. So I think it's quite appropriate that there are no quotation marks. Notice that the setting is already quite dark, so he's establishing mood as minimalistic as his writing is by saying, earlier that day the weather turned and the snow was melting into dirty water. So this is something that's becoming negative and ugly and dirty, and the story will as well. Streaks of it ran down the little shoulder-high window that faced the backyard. We were talking about windows previously, about how windows can represent access to the outdoors, freedom, opportunity. This window is small, it's shoulder high, and it's facing the back, not the front. These are all negative elements. Cars slushed by on the street outside where it was getting dark, but it was getting dark on the inside too. And of course, we see how dark things get emotionally as we see the couple stating dialogue, as I would argue, that's very typical when a couple is breaking up. I'm glad you're leaving, you son of a bitch. I'm so glad you're leaving. She began to cry. And they're arguing. And basically what they're arguing over is power. Who is going to have power over their child? A baby, that they treat as a possession, much like any of the other possessions that they are dividing up during their breakup. First they notice, or she notices, the baby's picture on the bed and picks it up. And he says, bring that back. Now, of course, it's not as if they could both have the picture. They can't rip it in half and each have half. They would ruin the picture. And I say this very deliberately because this is exactly what happens to the child by the time we get to the ending of the story. They rip that child in two. And she says, I want the baby. I want the baby. They're going back and forth. And she's holding the baby over a corner behind the stove. The kitchen is supposed to be a place of warmth and comfort and safety, but certainly not by the stove. And this is certainly a dangerous situation this child is in, especially because the baby is red-faced and screaming. So obviously there's something wrong. But neither parent pays attention to the child. They're too concerned, again, with ownership. In their scuffle, they knock down a flower pot. And basically, that's also a bit of foreshadowing. They kill something that was alive, and they're going to do something similar with their own baby. And you're hurting the baby. No, I'm not hurting the baby. And as they continue on, she says, or the text says, she would have it, this baby. Notice how the baby is referred to with the pronoun it, as if it were a possession. The kitchen window gave no light. Again, the idea is that things are pretty dark in there. And she would have it, this baby. She grabbed for the baby's other arm. She caught the baby around the wrist and leaned back. But he would not let go. He felt the baby slipping out of his hands, and he pulled back very hard. And in this manner, the issue was decided. And I know what we want. We want that one of the parents gets the baby. That's not what happens. When two adults pull as hard as they can on an infant, they've ripped that child in two. And if you know biblical stories, then you understand that this is a takeoff of the biblical story of Solomon. That in the biblical story of Solomon, there are two women who courted King Solomon, and both claim to be the mother of an infant. And King Solomon is unable to determine who the true mother is, so he decides the most fair thing would be to split the baby in two so that each woman can have half of the baby. And the biological mother steps forward and says, the other woman can have the baby. And King Solomon responds to the woman who stepped forward and says, you must be the biological mother, because only a biological mother would be willing to sacrifice in this way to protect her child. So in this story, what we see is what happens when neither parent is willing to sacrifice to protect their child. This is in 1981, when divorce is becoming much more commonplace, certainly not at the place where it is now, when approximately 50% of marriages end in divorce. But the idea is that this is what's happening to emotionally. This is what's happening emotionally to children in households across the world, and certainly across the United States, that they are being ripped emotionally between their parents as the parents are trying to get power and control over the other partner. So it's a cautionary tale is what it is. And the questions at the ending give you a hint, because it says, read the Bible for the story of Solomon. Read 1 Kings 3 in the Bible. How might popular mechanics be a retelling of this particular story? So those are basically the pieces that I wanted to end with this fiction section, though certainly we could have gone on. One of my students many years ago pointed out how dark these canonical pieces are, those works considered by scholars and critics to be worth academic study. I honestly had never thought about that when I was first studying literature, but then it occurred to me that they are dark. Perhaps that's what inspires authors to write, is strong emotion. And if they are trying to write for change, perhaps that's the reason why they are often motivated by the dark rather than the light. It's also one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that when we get to the drama section, we will read a Shakespearean comedy, not a tragedy, so that we can lighten things up. So the drama section is a little bit different than the short story section, because the drama section will have just 3 dramas, but those dramas are longer than the short stories. So we've got multiple classes devoted to each of the dramas, the first being Oedipus the King, which is a very old drama from 430 BC, Greek society. So one of the things we'll have to talk about is why we're reading something that's so old from a different culture. We're obviously reading a translation. The assumption is that we don't speak Greek. I know I certainly don't. In my mind, I've never really read Oedipus the King, because I've read many English translations and seen English translations, but I've never had an experience with the original Greek, because I'm not fluent or even speak any Greek. So I think that that's the way to approach this particular text. Each time you're reading a translation, it's going to be slightly different. What's more important is not the exact verbiage, but the story itself and the messages behind the story. In fact, we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about what drama is and how to read drama, and ultimately how drama is meant to be performed. And we will be watching performance of drama, starting with Oedipus the King. Ideally, we would watch a performance live, but that's just too logistically difficult. So instead, what we will be doing is watching a recorded version, but talking about that. And when we are finally discussing drama in class, we'll have multiple classes devoted to it so that we can watch performance and then talk about it. What would be ideal is that you read the drama in its entirety right at the beginning of our section for that particular drama, so that when we are spending the next couple of weeks talking about Oedipus, you're at home reading the next drama, and that happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. So we'll move from Oedipus the King to Shakespeare, a Shakespearean comedy. And then when hopefully we reach A Midsummer Night's Dream, you would have read it in its entirety at the beginning of the Midsummer Night's Dream section, so that when we're spending 2 weeks talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, you're reading the last drama in our drama unit, and that happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. And then when we're talking about Raisin in the Sun, you're contemplating writing assignments because, very similar to the fiction section, you're going to have to submit in a journal and ultimately a paper. So for the journals, for the fiction section, as you know, and some of you have already submitted in your journals, thank you, but I gave an extension until today, in the event that you wanted to have a little bit more time to contemplate which short stories to choose. I'm asking you to choose 3 short stories from the short story unit and to respond to each of those short stories in approximately a page or so. So that would end up being a journal of about 3 pages, but it can be as long or as short as it needs to be, with your thoughts and your observations and your questions, more than just plot. And I evaluated informally, not for grammar or mechanics, just for content, as if we were having conversation on paper. And then ultimately, too, I will evaluate it on an informal checkmark system rather than on the letter grade system. So a plus would be excellent, or a check plus would be very good, and a check would be satisfactory. That's where most of the grades fall, but there also is less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And I ask that you send that to me via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, because that's what works best with my grading program. And then I'll get that back to you. And my hope is that the journals might help you with formulating a paper, because eventually we will have a first paper due. Now, if you look in the syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see that I have uploaded 2 handouts that I normally would have given you in class. One is entitled Paper Topics for Fiction. Now, what I've tried to do is to generate suggested paper topics for each of the short stories that we've read thus far. But keep in mind that you can create your own paper topic. And if you were looking at that handout, and I'll go through it with you, paper number 1 is a critical paper. In other words, you should not be consulting outside resources. I'm not expecting you to do a research paper. That said, if you really want to write a research paper, we can negotiate. But it actually is a more difficult exercise, writing a research paper, because not only do you have to accumulate the information that other people have determined about a particular text, but you still have to add in your own original observations. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to defend a thesis, which we're going to be talking about. You can choose any of the topics listed, or you may write on your own topic. So I generated 8 possible topics. You're free to choose any of those. You can mix and match. You'll see that the topics I've selected are quite broad. I haven't determined the thesis for you. That's the harder part. The position that you are going to be taking that reasonable people could disagree about. And sometimes you don't even know what your thesis is when you begin writing a paper. You develop your thesis over the course of writing a paper. So I've had students who ultimately sometimes just write the paper, and then after they've written it, they read what they've written and they summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences. That's the thesis that you can plug in into the beginning. But I suggest that you might also want to think about some of the class discussion forum questions and also some of the videos as well as the questions at the ending of the text to assist you with possible paper topics. And the syllabus itself talks about exact paper formatting specifications. So it talks about specific elements such as that a paper should be typed, double-spaced, 1-inch margins, which I hope is a review of what you would have talked about in your English 101 class. But again, we'll also briefly talk about that as well. So reviewing the 8 topics, and again, this is the Paper Topics Fiction handout that I'm referencing. That's in your syllabus and other documents folder. Discuss the theme of isolation in Godwin's A Sorrowful Woman. Now, note that isolation appears in many of the stories that we've read. I just thought it would be particularly appropriate to talk about in A Sorrowful Woman, since we talked about that one of the reasons why she's so sorrowful is because she's misunderstood by her family and by society. She's not able to live up to the expectations of wife and mother, or she's unable to be fulfilled by the expectations of wife and mother, even though society says she should be. Or number 2, discuss the use of symbolism in Chopin's The Story of an Hour. And just about every literary text uses symbolism. But the story of an hour is so short. It's just basically about a page and a half or so. Literally is the story of one life-changing hour. That every word has significance in that piece. So it seemed that discussing the symbolism, and so much of the symbolism is associated with freedom and with opportunity and with epiphany, as we had talked about, that would be a possible paper topic. Discuss the theme of death in Faulkner's Rose for Emily. And when we talked about Rose for Emily, we talked about how that piece is more than just about the death of central characters, such as Miss Emily, or her father, or Homer, but it also is about the death of a way of life, of the former Southern aristocracy that would be given a certain level of privilege in society. Number 4, compare the theme of love in Faulkner's A Rose for Emily and Van der Zee's A Secret Sorrow. Remember, we read A Secret Sorrow and talked about how it was an examination of formulaic writing, that it didn't have a lot of depth or complexity to it. It was fairly predictable and trite. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing if you're looking for escapism or entertainment, but it probably wasn't worth much of our time. That said, comparing that kind of writing to something that's much more complex, such as A Rose for Emily, especially because we had talked about the mixed chronology in Rose for Emily, that if the chronology were in order, in some ways it would be predictable. However, there's still elements, despite the fact that it could be predictable if it was put in chronological order, that make A Rose for Emily much more complex than anything we would see in A Secret Sorrow. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about Miss Emily perhaps being a symbol or a representation of a fallen South, and Homer being perhaps a symbol or a representation of an up-and-coming North. Or number 5, discuss the theme of ambiguity in Young Goodman Brown. We had talked about that we can never know for certain whether or not the witch meeting actually occurred in Young Goodman Brown. And we're not supposed to. The author gives us an equal number of pieces of evidence to support a witch meeting and an equal number of pieces to support a hallucination or a dream. What's important is how Goodman changes because of the witch meeting and what we're supposed to learn from it. Goodman loses his faith, literally and figuratively, because he discovers something that is true but isn't necessarily acknowledged by Puritanism, that we all have evil within us and hypocrisy exists within all of us. We should not follow Goodman's example and basically die with no hopeful tomb upon our verse. When, I'm not even saying if, when we make that realization ourselves, that there is evil and hypocrisy in the world. Examine the role of conflict in Hemingway's A Soldier's Home. Obviously, Krebs is a veteran, so he served in a war, which is a conflict. But I would suggest that the new war, the new conflicts are even more complex when he returns home or attempts to return home, and he's misunderstood by his family and by his society. He's trying to reintegrate into society and is unable to do so. He's even battling with himself as he's trying to appease his family, but he's also trying to stay true to his needs. Compare or discuss the theme of battle in Ellison's Battle Royal. Well, obviously the word battle is in the title, and there is a battle, a literal boxing match. But there are also lots of other battles, and many of them are emotional, as we see with the Invisible Man. Battles within himself, much like Krebs has battles within himself, and battles with others to try to gain a certain level of respect and acknowledgement in society, which, of course, he's unable to do because he's Black. And then lastly, compare and contrast. I like compare and contrast papers, but particularly the last 2 short stories, Girl and Popular Mechanics, are quite short. So you might feel that there really wasn't enough content there for you to devote an entire paper to one piece, though you should be able to. One of the elements of literature is that you should be able to take, let's say, a 5-line poem and write a 5-page paper about it. As we'll talk about when we get to poetry. But if that just seems to be a little bit too much of a stretch at this point, you can talk about similarities and differences between these 2 pieces that were written around the same time, but have very different authors and very different writing styles. And then at the bottom of this handout, I have a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing. Is have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? Now, this is a tall order to be able to do all these things, which means that what you want to be able to do is to start early. And that means that you're writing in stages and pieces rather than trying to do it all at the last minute, which is where I direct you to the second handout that I uploaded onto our syllabus and other documents website entitled The Critical Paper. And again, this is what we're writing, a critical paper, not a research paper. Though again, if you really wanted to write a research paper, you could always negotiate with me. Because one of my goals in class is that by the ending of the semester, you should be able to approach a text that you've never read before. And without a teacher and without classmates, you should be able to make a certain level of sense out of that text. So this particular handout on the critical paper was actually given to me when I was an undergraduate student many years ago. I still consider it to be one of the best that exists in terms of writing a critical paper. And I'm very hopeful that this is all review for you. Note that the first paper for short story, according to our syllabus, was going to be due on one date, but since I gave you an extension for the journal, I'm going to give you an extension also for the paper number 1. So now paper number 1 will be due on Thursday, the 20th, rather than on the 18th, which is Tuesday. That said, you can always hand in a paper early. And as I had indicated, all of you have the option of rewriting the first paper. So basically, when I receive the paper, I will review it, this time for grammar and mechanics, as well as content, unlike the journals. And I will put a letter grade on it. And if you're content with the letter grade that you earn, then you're done with the assignment. But if it turns out that you wanted to earn a higher grade, you could do a revision. You could take my comments into account, and then if you still need further direction, you can consult with me. And I ask that you hand in the revision along with the original graded copy with my comments so I can compare and contrast them. And you should get the higher of the 2 grades. And I don't feel like I'm giving away anything by doing this. This is really the way professional authors write. They go through multiple drafts and multiple stages. You have until the ending of the semester to submit in your revision, but the sooner the better for everybody involved, obviously. And the second paper will be very similar to the first paper. It will just be devoted to our second unit, which is drama. And that will be due towards the ending of the semester, the assumption being that there really wouldn't be much time for you to do a revision, so that you don't have a revision for the second paper. That said, I've had some students hand in paper number 2 early enough that we were able to negotiate, but this requires negotiation for a revision for the second paper. For the first paper, you don't need to do that. And then, of course, our very last unit in class will be on poetry. There won't be time for you to write a paper on poetry, but you will have the final exam that's devoted to poetry. But again, if you look at the handout in the syllabus and other documents folder about the critical paper, you'll see that it's basically divided into 3 elements: planning, writing, and editing. And I can tell you right now that most students skip the planning and the editing phase. They go straight to the writing stage. They wait too long. They do this right before the paper is due. So they end up with the substandard product. So you really want to put some effort and time into planning and trying to think about ideas of what it is that you could write about. In fact, that's going to be today's attendance question. Is I'm going to ask you about paper number 1, and I'm going to ask, at this point, do you have an idea of which short story you would be writing paper number 1 about? And if so, why? And of course, if you don't, you can indicate why you don't have an idea. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm trying to get you to start thinking about paper number 1 now, even though we still have some time. And as I indicated, you don't have to respond to your classmates' responses, but you do have to read their responses and my responses in turn. So that'll give you an idea what would be discussed in class. And as the handout continues, once it talks about the planning stage, it talks about the actual writing stage. And then finally, the editing stage, which again, most students skip because they've quite frankly run out of time and run out of energy. So you want to make sure that you are keeping to those 3. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that next class, about the planning stage, the writing stage, and the editing stage, that particular handout, as well as talk a little bit about documentation, because that's one of the elements that you will need to incorporate within your paper. You need to use evidence to support your position. You're much like a courtroom attorney, where you are presenting an argument to a judge and a jury, and you're picking and choosing the pieces of evidence that will help your case, which means that you're using paraphrase, you're putting things in your own language, but you are also using quotation. You're writing things out word for word. And that means that there are certain conventions that you need to follow. And I know sometimes it can be complex because certain disciplines have different conventions. So if you're familiar with the American Psychological Association, or APA, they have a certain series of rules for how you document or quote in the sciences. But we're not the sciences, we're the humanities. So the system of rules we use are the MLA, or the Modern Language Association, which again, I'm hopeful is something that you would have talked about in your previous English class. But I will be reviewing that as well, and you can see that I've got some information in the notes below that I will be accessing next class as well to talk about that handout, as well as the idea of resources. One resource that I highly recommend that you might have heard of before is Purdue OWL. And Purdue OWL is a website from Purdue University that talks about the entire writing process. They've made it accessible to everyone, regardless of whether or not you're a Purdue student. And the link is below. I assume also that you've got handbooks from previous classes and so forth. And another great website that people tend to forget is our own GCC library. And you can see that in the notes below, I've included the website link to the writing and citation guides that are posted from the GCC library, because the GCC library is well aware that you are going to be writing papers through your academic career. So they've also talked about some of the conventions of writing. So that's another source that you could utilize. But as I said, next class, I wanted to talk briefly about that as well and review that handout, the critical paper, with you, as well as begin to introduce the idea of drama, what it is and how we go about reading it. And again, for today's attendance question, it's about paper number 1. What story do you think you'll write about and why? Again, you can change your mind. You're not committed to anything. And you're perfectly fine saying, I don't know, because this is something that you can examine over the next several classes. But if you don't know, talk about some of the reasons why you don't know. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class talking about how to write papers and what exactly is drama and how do we read it and write about it. Take care. Bye-bye.